Hi everyone, my name is John Clark and this is my GE113 presentation on Air Ontario Flight 1363, a crash that should never have happened. Let me set the scene. March 10th, 1989. A small regional jet gets ready for takeoff through the snow on a wintry day in Dryden, Ontario. The passengers are relieved to finally be on the final leg of a frustrating flight. Mechanical issues, delays, extra passengers, and weather have all put Air Ontario Flight 1363 several hours behind schedule. The frustrated crew are hopeful that things won't get any worse, but they will. Flying is one of the safest ways for people to travel today. Unfortunately, one reason for this is the numerous accidents that have occurred over the years. The aviation industry has learned from these accidents to ensure a higher safety standard. The crash of Flight 1363 was one of the biggest wake-up calls for the aviation industry in Canada. In this presentation, we will discuss and disclose the link of unfortunate events that led to Air Ontario Flight 1363's crash, and we will also discuss the ramifications that this event had on the aviation industry. We'll start by looking at some of the issues that led to the accident. In 1987, 2 years before the crash, Air Ontario was formed from the merger of two very different companies, Air Ontario and Austin Airways. Air Ontario, before the merger, was the first feeder airline to Air Canada. It operated in southern Ontario and the northern United States, on the smaller routes that it wouldn't be economical for Air Canada to run with the aircraft that it was currently operating. Air Ontario was a relatively small airline with only 11 mid-size aircraft. Austin Airways, on the other hand, was a much more far-reaching operation. It operated in northern Ontario. They had a large fleet of several different types of aircraft, ranging from small bush and float planes to larger cargo aircraft, used to haul loads of supplies into remote northern communities. Austin Airways was also one of Canada's oldest airlines. It was founded in 1934. The merger did not go smoothly. Austin Airways was a more laid-back organization, without unions and less structured. Pilots were expected to do everything at the smaller northern airstrips out of which they operated. Air Ontario, on the other hand, was very structured and unionized. All tasks were very clearly defined, and there was no wiggle room in the rules. Following amalgamation, the pilots, wanting clarity on the rules and the new pay structure, went on strike for 2 months following the merger. The company had to sell its northern bush routes along with their planes, as the new corporate structure could no longer support the more laid-back flying style. This in turn forced them to lay off around 250 employees, a third of their staff. Due to these circumstances, Air Ontario's corporate culture was not the best at the time of Flight 1363, and some of the blame for what happened falls to the company. While all this was happening, Air Ontario started looking into acquiring some jet-powered aircraft. They settled on the Fokker F-28, a Dutch plane with a relatively good passenger capacity and reputation. The first paying passengers flew on the summer of 1988, hardly a year before the accident and only a year after the merger. This was a very rushed introduction of the jets into the fleet, especially since Air Ontario had no pilots who were familiar with this type of aircraft. However, the company wanted to make sure that the jets were in service, putting undue pressure on the pilots and ground staff. Another issue, parts were hard to come by for the Dutch airplane, and things were constantly broken. On the day of the accident, the crew manning the aircraft consisted of Captain George Morwood, First Officer Keith Mills, Purser Catherine Say, and Flight Attendant Sonia Hartwick. Captain Morwood and First Officer Mills both had some jet experience, but they were still unexperienced flying the F-28. Captain Morwood only had around 80 hours of flight time on the day of the accident. The planned flight that day was from Winnipeg to Thunder Bay and back, with stops in Dryden going and coming. They hoped to do this route twice that day. After arriving at the airport, the captain received some bad news. The auxiliary power unit, or APU, was broken, still. It had been broken for the last 5 days. This was a big problem because it meant that he couldn't shut down the engines in Dryden. To understand this, let's take a quick look at the APU and the engine start system. The APU is a small jet engine, used on the ground to do the jobs that the main jet engines normally do. It's inefficient and dangerous to use the main jet engines on the ground because of the thrust that they produce. The APU, when on the ground, runs the air conditioning system and the electrical system. It is also used to supply air to the main jet engine's air starters for starting. The APU propels large quantities of air through the ductwork to the air starter, which spins the engine up to speed. Once running, excess air from the running engine can be used to start the second one, and the APU can be shut down. However, if the APU isn't working, the only way to start the engines is with an engine start cart, a large air compressor that supplies the air necessary to start the engine. Dryden Airport didn't have a start cart for the F-28. Air Ontario couldn't afford to put them everywhere. So one engine had to be left running on the stops in Dryden, something that pilots dislike doing as it creates an extra hazard to themselves, the passengers, and the ground crew. Captain Morwood expressed his displeasure that this issue still hadn't been rectified. The aircraft left Winnipeg 30 minutes behind schedule. After making a normal stop in Dryden, other than the running engine, the F-28 arrived in Thunder Bay. Here the aircraft was shut down, the passengers were unloaded, and the aircraft prepared for departure back to Winnipeg. The aircraft was refueled with enough fuel to make it back to Winnipeg without refueling in Dryden. Then, as the passengers who were scheduled for the flight began to board, another issue arose. Air Canada had cancelled one of its flights to Winnipeg and booked 10 extra passengers on Air Ontario. Captain Morwood didn't want to take any extra passengers since the F-28 was near its maximum weight. However, Air Ontario insisted that the Air Canada passengers be accommodated, since they were under Air Canada and wanted to maintain good relations. This meant that the crew would have to deload fuel to be within the weight limits. They also wouldn't have enough fuel to make it straight to Winnipeg. They would have to refuel when they landed in Dryden with an engine running. This is a very dangerous practice called hot refueling. When refueling, the greatest danger is static electricity, and every caution is taken to dissipate and prevent any static electricity from sparking. However, with the engine running and the fuel tank open and gas pumping, there are sources of electricity that cannot be grounded, increasing the risk to the aircraft. Captain Morwood had to comply with the company's demands, so he took on the extra passengers. The deloading of fuel cost the flight more time, and they left Thunder Bay about a full hour behind schedule. Upon arriving in Dryden the second time, weather had begun to set in. Large, wet, fluffy snowflakes had already begun to fall at a steady rate. The aircraft pulled up at the terminal and shut down only the left engine. 8 passengers got off, and 7 took their place on Flight 1363. While this was happening, the airplane's fuel tanks were topped up for the next leg to Winnipeg. Not only was this a dangerous hot refueling operation, but they were also fueling with passengers on board the aircraft, something that is now illegal. If there had been an explosion, everyone on board could have died. Meanwhile, the snow had begun to fall more heavily. Morwood called Air Ontario operations to inform them of a short delay. His conversations became heated, and he left the terminal disgusted. The fueling was now complete, and the first engine was restarted, and the plane began to taxi out of the runway. We don't know why Captain Morwood didn't conduct a walk-around, but if he had, he might have noticed the snow that was building steadily on his wings. Because of the running engines, the aircraft could not be de-iced. Dryden Airport did have the equipment to de-ice the plane. However, with the engines running, the de-ice fluid could get sucked into the engines and then into the air conditioning system, poisoning the passengers and the crew inside. Apparently, Captain Morwood asked if there was any de-ice equipment, but never asked to be de-iced, since he couldn't be. As the weather continued to worsen and heavy snowflakes fell faster every minute, the flight was ready for takeoff. Suddenly, a small plane called in an emergency. A small Cessna 150 couldn't fly in these conditions and had to land. This delay continued to provoke the irritated Morwood. He expressed his frustration to the airport control, then announced on the PA system, "Well, folks, it just isn't our day." The small plane ended up landing safely. After it had taxied off the runway, the doomed F-28 taxied to the end of the runway where it was pointing into the wind. A large burst of wind sent a cloud of snow around the airplane as it ready for takeoff. The precipitation rate was so heavy that, even at the temperature of -1, there was still half an inch of snow on the runway. The wings were covered with snow by the time the captain throttled up the engines for departure. Survivors of the crash later said that the snow on the wings was melting, but not as fast as new snow was falling. There was over half an inch of snow on the wing when the F-28 started rolling down the runway. While snow blew off the plane once it began to move, it only revealed the killer that had been building below it: ice. In the end, the large amounts of ice covering the entire wing prevented the aircraft from generating enough lift to take off. The plane left the end of the runway just 15 feet above the ground and was never able to generate lift to fly. The F-28 hit trees and then the ground less than a kilometer from the end of the runway. Both pilots, one flight attendant, and 21 passengers were killed. 44 passengers and one crew member survived with injuries. The aircraft broke up into pieces upon impacting the ground, and the fuel was ignited. As the aircraft began to burn, the survivors scrambled to get outside. One man helped to rescue 12 people from the burning aircraft, although he himself was drenched with the fuel. The flight attendant, who survived, even though injured, helped care for people with severe burns until help arrived. Of the 47 people that survived the initial crash, only 2 died later in hospital. Transport Canada's investigative branch, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, began an investigation into the crash the very next day. However, the government quickly realized that more was going on behind the scenes than just a simple icing accident. 19 days after the crash, the responsibility for the investigation was taken from the CASB and given to a special commission headed up by the Honorable Justice Virgil P. Mashansky. As the issues of de-icing, the broken APU, the chaos in the company all began to emerge, it became evident that many changes had to be made. Why hadn't the APU been fixed? Was Transport Canada auditing Air Ontario properly? Did First Officer Mills, who had experience flying in the Arctic, notice the snow on the wings? Did he say anything to Captain Morwood? Overall, the Commission wrote 4 reports with over 1,700 pages between them, and offered 191 recommendations to the Canadian aviation industry. At the time, it was the most thorough investigation the government had ever made. The final investigation report gave many suggestions, and changes were made. The 2 major changes were the banning of hot refueling and the recommendation to use better types of de-icing fluid, which I'll talk about in a moment. The report also pointed out the difficult situation that the pilot was in with the undue pressures that were on him because of the state of the aircraft and the company. The report also recommended more open communication between the flight crew. Crashes, like Flight 1363, can sometimes doom smaller airlines. However, Air Ontario picked up the pieces, fixed its mistakes, and carried on for another 10 years. They got rid of the one other F-28, instead renewing their fleet with Canadian-made de Havilland Dash 8s. These aircraft were perfectly equipped for flying in the north, and since they were turboprops, it was easy for the pilots of Air Ontario to transition to them. In 2002, Air Ontario was one of 4 companies that merged together to become Jazz Aviation. At the time of the merger, Air Ontario was doing quite well with 48 Dash 8s, flying to almost all of the smaller cities in Ontario, and to some in the US as well. There's a chance you could still fly on an Air Ontario Dash 8 today if you fly Air Canada Express, whose fleet is owned and operated by Jazz. In 1990, the Transportation Safety Board, or TSB, was formed from the old Canadian Aviation Safety Board. It separated from Transport Canada so as to have more authority in its recommendations about accidents. Before this, their findings from investigations were not binding to Transport Canada, which is one of the reasons that the separate commission had been formed. As a separate government program, the TSB is now able to report directly to Parliament for better communication between the branches of the government. Probably the biggest change after the crash was the introduction of the clean aircraft concept into Canada's aviation laws. It says, "No person shall conduct or attempt to conduct a takeoff in an aircraft that has frost, ice, or snow adhering to any of its critical surfaces." This meant that airlines, airports, and pilots had to do things differently. Airlines had to ensure that aircraft could be de-iced. Airports had to make sure that the de-ice equipment was in a location so that aircraft could be de-iced effectively. and pilots had to start doing more detailed walkarounds to ensure the aircraft was clean and safe for flight. This was already in practice in some places, but it finally became law. The final major finding was the fact that the current de-ice fluid, Type 1 fluid, was not able to handle wet snow or fast-forming ice. The Commission discovered that, even if the airplane had been de-iced, the de-ice fluid available in Dryden would have been ineffective in the conditions and the plane may have crashed anyway. The Commission recommended the use of anti-ice fluid, Type 2 fluid, that not only removes ice, but prevents more ice from forming on the wings. Anti-ice fluid is now used at all major airports for de-icing operations. However, despite the changes made in Canada, the US didn't look into the recommendations made during the investigation. As a result, 3 years later, in similar weather conditions, US Air Flight 405 crashed while taking off from LaGuardia Airport in New York City. This aircraft was once again a Fokker F-28. Once again, the cause of the crash was the accumulation of ice and snow on the wings. However, this aircraft had been de-iced prior to takeoff. It was later discovered that LaGuardia was only using de-ice fluid, Type 1, not the recommended anti-ice fluid, which was Type 2. Due to delays, the Type 1 fluid had passed its time of effectiveness, and ice had reformed on the wings. This accident shocked the Canadian industry, who claimed they had sent their findings to the US government. However, the warnings were not followed, and more people lost their lives. This crash, along with a few other similar accidents, caused laws similar to the ones in place in Canada to also come into effect in the US. In this presentation, we discussed and disclosed the link of unfortunate events that led to Air Ontario Flight 1363's crash, and we also discussed the ramifications this event had on the aviation industry. This accident was a tragedy. However, the positive repercussions of the aftermath and investigation have saved many lives, and it assures that, especially in Canada, flying in the winter is just as safe as flying in the summer. So remember, next time you're delayed in the winter, it's better to be late than to never arrive. Thank you for your time. The APU is a small jet engine, used on the ground to do the jobs that the main jet engines normally do. The fluid had passed its time of effectiveness. Alright, I'm going to redo this. Sorry, I'm so sorry. In this report, which I just messed up because I can't speak in front of people.